Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Heather and today I'm here to talk to you about all the books that I read in September. I cannot believe that it is October already, and even though I was worried about not being able to read a lot in September, I actually read a surprising amount, although a lot of them were either ebooks or audiobooks, which is slightly different for me. Before I go any further, however, fair warning, I did get my flu shot today and I'm starting to feel it a little bit, but I put makeup on when I came home and I am determined not to let it go to waste. So I've got a big glass of water next to me. I've got a heating pad here in my lap if you hear any rustling, and we're gonna carry on. But if I seem a little bit off, that's why. So first, let's talk about the physical books that I read. And the first book that I read this month, which was my classic, was Dr. Thorne by Anthony Trollope, which I really enjoyed. I was disappointed that there wasn't more of a connection to the first two Barchester books in terms of characters and so on, but I really enjoyed this story as a standalone. If you're unfamiliar with it, it's the story of Dr. Thorne, who ends up basically adopting his young niece, Mary. He's a single man. Mary is the illegitimate child of his sister and a neighboring family, but he doesn't care. He brings her up the way you should any young lady. She turns into a wonderful woman, and she grows up quite close to the neighboring rich family, the Greshams. And indeed, as they grow older, Frank Gresham discovers that he really quite likes Mary. However, the Gresham's finances are not great, and his mother is determined that he should marry for money and position. That is basically the crux of this book. And I feel like I've given a lot away with that because honestly, so little happens within these 400 or so pages, and yet everything happens within the 400 and so pages. It's very typical of Anthony Trollope and Austen and those types of writers. So if you enjoy that slower paced slice of life kind of novel, this is definitely one for you. I have not yet watched the Amazon series that Julian Fellows did a few years ago, but it is on my list since it's Victober. Then, in honor of the Queen's passing, I read two books. The first one that I read was The Queen and I by Sue Townsend. And this works on the premise of what if the newly elected government gets rid of the royal family, moves them into council housing, and what would that be like for them? How would each member deal with that? And what would their neighbors think? How would the new prime minister deal with his position? And I really enjoyed the psychology of all of those different areas of life. It is also quite fascinating to see which members of the royal family are spoken about in here because, of course, it was written in 1992. Well, it was published in 92. It was probably written earlier in 90 or 91. And so Princess Diana and Charles are still married. Harry and William are quite little still. The Queen Mother was still alive. So it looks at different members of the royal family than I'm used to thinking about, which is weird considering that I'm not that old. I'm about as old as this book, in fact. I also found it really interesting that this book, slight spoiler here, did predict that Diana and Charles did not work as a couple. They didn't predict the exact circumstances. Sue Townsend's interpretation is quite different. But it's interesting that so many other people picked up on that. I was 6 when she died, so what did I know? I'm always used to studying their relationship as history. However, for all that it's billed as a comic novel, or at least that I expected it to be a comic novel given Sue Townsend's other books, I just found it very sad. looking at the way relationships break down, at the way no matter what government seems to be in power, this kind of poverty is never truly fixed. That some members of the royal family would not be able to handle this, and the horrendous mental toll that that puts on both them and their loved ones. So it's still a very interesting read, but I wouldn't necessarily say that it's the comic read that I originally thought it was going to be. And the second book that I read, or rather that I reread, was The Audience by Peter Morgan. And this is the play that's probably most famous for starring Helen Mirren as the Queen for a second time. And I say it's a reread. I've never physically read it before, but I did get to see it when it came to Broadway in 2015. And it looks at the Queen through the lens of the weekly audiences that she has with her prime ministers, I believe every Tuesday. Or rather that she had, although I'm sure King Charles is doing the same thing. And so you get to see, I don't know about all the prime ministers, but you do get to see a great majority of the prime ministers that worked with the Queen over the years. And you hear about others in between as well. And it's fascinating because it really does feel like these are conversations that could have happened. And I don't know how much access Peter Morgan was given, or did he completely make this up altogether? But it feels incredibly real. It gives you great insight into the Queen as a person and how she viewed her role as Queen, from both the time when she was a little girl to now that she is much older. And it also gives you incredible insight into the lives of each of the prime ministers. Because speaking as an American, there are some that I knew a great deal about. Like, for example, I lived when David Cameron was prime minister, so I was very familiar with him and Tony Blair. You, of course, hear about Winston Churchill and Margaret Thatcher all the time. But there were others that you don't necessarily hear about, and I learned a great deal about them, which was really lovely. So if you didn't get to see that play, I would highly encourage you to at least read it. Then for my nonfiction book of the month, I had yet another reread, which is CeCe True, CeCe Myth and Truth by Katrin Unterreiner. And this was originally written in German, and it was translated by Neil Radford. And this is a book that I actually bought in Vienna when we went there when I was 13. And I hadn't really looked at it since. But ever since reading the novelization of the series The Empress, which just came out on US Netflix at least, I was faced with a lot of questions about Empress Elizabeth of Austria and how much of that story was in fact true. So I went back to this biography, which is one of the top 2 biographies of Empress Elizabeth that you can find in English. And it's not very long. It's a very basic overview. And there are some passages that I had to read several times because the translation feels a bit clunky sometimes. But it is still full of really good information, considering that very few people on this side of the Atlantic, at least, know anything about her. She was Empress of Austria in the mid to late 1800s, and I believe Empress of Hungary as well during that time. I always forget which other countries the Austro-Hungarian Empire was annexing at that point, and it did clear up a lot, and that a lot of the plot points, at least, the major plot points at least, in the Netflix series do look as though they are true. For example, Emperor Franz Josef was originally intended for her older sister, but instead he chose to marry Elizabeth, or CeCe as was her nickname. But this book takes you beyond that brief youthful point that is shown in the series, and it shows you the rest of her life. And I was talking with my friend about it the other night, and I wonder if the new series is an attempt to further reclaim her image, which has been ultra romanticized. First of all, after her death, she was murdered by a revolutionary in the late 1800s, but then further romanticized by a couple of German films that came out in the 1950s. And they created this incredibly romantic image of her that isn't necessarily true, and that was part of what this book was striving to do. And so I did appreciate that it showed all sides of her, both the beautiful and interesting sides. She was obsessed with beauty and with fashion, and the photos of her clothing or replicas of her clothing are indeed beautiful. She was a wonderful poet. She was an incredible horsewoman. She had many, many talents. But it also touched on some of her failings, how detached she was from some of her children, the way that the stiffness of the Austrian court was portrayed to the public, and the undercurrents of dislike of the royal family that were brewing. So if you've watched that series, or if you're interested in watching this series, I would recommend reading this book alongside it to get a good dose of the actual history, along with a fun television series whose costumes look nothing like historically accurate, it has to be said. I then made sure to have some fun books on my TBR, books that I knew I would want to go back to again and again during a very busy and very stressful month. So the first of those was Yours Cheerfully by A.J. Pierce, which is the sequel to Dear Mrs. Bird, which I read back in January. So this follows Emmy after the events of book one as, well, I can't really tell you anything because the resolution of the problems of book one happens right in the last chapter. But we do follow Emmy and Bunty's adventures going forward in World War II London. This book was also tragicomic, I guess you would call it. It had its moments of levity, it had moments of true devastation and horror, which is what life was like at the times. Yeah, it was just a lovely, I don't really want to say cozy, but then again, it kind of was cozy jaunt. So if you enjoyed Dear Mrs. Bird, the sequel was written along very similar lines, so I think you would enjoy it as well. Then I read The Deep by Rivers Solomon, which was kind of a departure for me. I don't tend to read futuristic work of any sort. And much as I had heard about Afrofuturist books, this was my first venture into them myself. But the premise sounded really, really interesting, and after percolating on it for a few years, I finally decided to do it. And this tells the story of a young woman called Yetu, who is part of a species that developed as the offspring of African slave women who were pregnant when they were thrown overboard from slave ships. And this posits that those descendants evolved into some kind of mer people. And Yetu is one of those mer people a few centuries later. And that's really all I can tell you. It is a novella, so everything happens really quite quickly. But much as I loved that premise, this book was nothing like what I expected it to be, and therefore didn't really gel with me. It, first of all, felt very disjointed. You jump backwards and forwards in time a lot as Solomon tries to explain both the present circumstances of Yetu and her people. We then jump backwards to find out their origins and then jump forwards again, which is apparently even further forward than modern day. So there was a constant feeling of disorientation for me, coupled with the fact that Yetu really struggles with a great many mental illnesses, major trigger warnings for anxiety, eating disorders, panic disorders, anything along those lines. And then it ended incredibly quickly. And its moral messages as well, or at least its ethical messages about what it was saying about race and history, were a little bit muddled for me. I was never entirely sure which of those points I was supposed to take away from it. Maybe that is the point, that ancestral memory, especially for Black people, is so painful and so complicated that there are many different ways that Solomon is saying that you could think about it. I don't know, I just wanted it to be a little bit clearer and for it to feel more like a legend, and it wasn't quite that. I think overall it was well done, but it just wasn't for me. Now let's talk about some of the digital reading that I did. So first of all, I read a couple of arcs this month from NetGalley, the first of which was The Whalebone Theater by Joanna Quinn. And this had a really interesting setup, that it followed 3 children from childhood to adulthood during the first quarter or so of the 20th century. So we follow them from the late 1900s all the way through World War II, and that their lives center around plays, both the roles that they play in the family and in the world, and in literal plays, that they take pleasure in staging plays, especially in a theater that later on in the novel Christabel has built out of the rib cage of a whale that washes up on the beach. That premise sounded really, really good, and I'm not gonna lie, I was influenced by the UK cover of this book, which is beautiful. But honestly, I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would. There were moments of absolute brilliance, but in other ways, I found it got so literary that it became very, very boring. And then the other arc that I read this month was Finding Jean Kelly by Tori Jean, which is a contemporary romance book, which I don't tend to read many of. But this follows our heroine, who is a baking blogger living in Paris. She is American, but she is living in Paris, and she is also living with endometriosis. She is quite happy with her life until an old flame from her hometown shows up, and she is horrified by this because, much as she always liked him, she always felt like he made her life miserable. And thus we embark on the enemies to lovers trope, or rather perceived enemies to lovers. There are a lot of misunderstandings that go on in this book. Honestly, I was drawn to it because of all of the old movie references that it makes, the title especially, but lots of other old movie references are peppered throughout, like other Gene Kelly films, Audrey Hepburn films, which I absolutely adore. I also loved this book a lot more than I thought I would. I don't ordinarily like enemies to lovers. I don't ordinarily like contemporary romances at all. But this one I thought was very well done because it just felt really realistic. Any of the problems that this couple had to work through, they worked through in a reasonable way. They made sure to talk about them. And all of the solutions they came up with were solutions that I think anyone in their position could have come up with. I also loved how frank it was about living with a chronic illness like endometriosis. I thought I understood what endometriosis was. I clearly did not. This book is very, very frank about all of the things that that disease can do to your body on a daily basis. And I really applaud the author for sharing that part of herself in the main character. Yeah, all of those combined made it a really enjoyable read, if stressful at times. ultimately very uplifting and hopeful, which I really appreciated. I also read through volumes 1 through 4 of the Heartstopper graphic novels, or rather, their webcomic forms on the Webtoons app, and I flew through them. They are very sweet, very wholesome, although they do also discuss, quite frankly, mental illness and eating disorders and homophobia, but ultimately they are so sweet and uplifting, and I really enjoyed them. I haven't watched the Netflix series yet, although now technically I can, and I suppose I should. But I wanted to be sure to read them first so I could enjoy the artistic touches that they put in the films that come from the comic forms. If you haven't heard about it, Heartstopper is a graphic novel series that follows Nick and Charlie, who are two boys in high school in the UK. Nick is out and openly gay, but he starts to fall for rugby boy Charlie, who may or may not be straight. Like I said, these are just sweet and soul-warming, and I highly recommend them. And I then listened to a couple of audio books. The first of which was A Dead Gin and Cairo by P. Jelly Clark, which is a short story or novella. I forget how exactly they categorize it, but it is part of a series of stories that he has taking place in Cairo that weave in supernatural elements from, I believe, from Muslim mythology. Certainly a jinn is from Muslim folklore. And this follows a young female detective in Cairo. I believe it takes place in the early part of the 20th century, and she and her partner discover a murdered jinn, which sets off a whole train of events of her trying to figure out who murdered this jinn, why, and what on earth is going on here. I enjoyed some elements, like the discussions of feminism within Islam and the inclusion of Muslim folklore like jinn. Honestly, I was hoping to find out a little bit more about how jinn are supposed to work, as opposed to how they have been shown to work in kind of usurped Muslim folklore like genies and so on. I know they don't work exactly that way, but I've never been sure exactly how they do work instead. So I was hoping to love this one, and I really didn't. Part of it is definitely my fault. I listened to it while I was working late one night, and I was doing a million other things around the classroom, and so I was a bit distracted, so I wasn't absorbing all of the story as well as I could have. But I also discussed this with a friend of mine who also read it, and he said that it definitely isn't just me, that he also felt like P. Jelly Clark was trying to do too much within a very short story, and if he had expanded it into a full-length novel, that it could have been so much better, because he would have had the space to explore all of the folkloric and cultural avenues that he wanted to, along with solving the mystery. But by leaving it so short, everything wraps up quite quickly, and you feel like you've missed out on a lot as a reader. I'm still intrigued to read other books in this series to see if it improves over time, and hopefully when I'm a bit less distracted as well. And then I finished the Linda Walheim series thus far. I'm hoping that Meddy Ivy Harrison writes more in the future, but the last one was just published last year, so I'm going to give her a little bit of time to work on that. In case you missed it, the Linda Walheim mystery series is a mystery series that centers around Linda Walheim, who is a bishop's wife in modern day Utah. She is an LDS bishop's wife. And so book 4 is Not of This Fold. And this one looks at racism within Utah and within the LDS Church. It starts when a friend of Linda's brings in a Hispanic woman and her children who come from the Spanish ward. So a ward is a neighborhood area, and so everyone from a certain area would attend a certain church. But the LDS Church here has created a Spanish ward specifically for members of the church who are Hispanic and or don't speak a lot of English. So services would be held in Spanish. At least that's how I understood it. However, a few days later, Gabriella turns up dead behind a gas station, and Gwen is determined to find out who murdered her, and Gwen does not trust the police. And so Linda goes along partly to figure out the murder of Gabriella, but also to try and rein in Gwen, and discovers that it is very difficult to do both at the same time. Book 5 then follows on from that and takes on the Me Too movement within the LDS Church. And Linda is called in by one of her sons to investigate what happens to a young woman who used to babysit for her granddaughter. And Joseph and his wife are very worried because this young girl has disappeared. She has dropped out of school. Her parents don't know where she is. They're pretty sure she's living on the streets at 15. And they call in Linda because she has good sleuthing skills, and she's got that motherly instinct to see if she can figure out what on earth happened to this girl. And she does find out, and I will say this last one was very, very hard to read. I do have to put a slight spoiler here. Major trigger warnings for rape and sexual assault and slut shaming, as well as graphic depictions of what it is truly like as a homeless person in the winter. I have always admired this series for tackling problems or problem areas within the church. I am not a member myself, but my dear, dear friend is. And I've always admired the way this series tackles problems because she focuses in on a particular problem and presents it saying, this is something we desperately need to look at. Here are both sides of the argument. Do something. And then she leaves it up to the audience to think about it and decide, okay, what would be the best course of action? However, these last two got very, very difficult to read because Linda becomes more and more frustrated with the structures of the church, particularly the patriarchal structures. And in response to that frustration, her husband starts digging his heels in and starts clinging to those more conservative traditions. And the last book especially gets really hard to listen to because she and her husband are having such severe problems. Within the first chapter, I was convinced that Kurt had turned into a completely different person than I had ever known. And I'm sure that's what it felt like to Linda as well. And she starts to express really serious doubts about the church and her place in it, if she wants to have a place in it at all. So I would highly recommend this series. I think they're very, very well done. But they are not easy breezy. They are addictive. You have to know what happens next, but they are very hard to read. So there you have it. Those are all of the books that I read in September. Please leave me some comments down below about any books that you read in September that you would highly recommend to me. If you have further thoughts or further questions about any of the books that I talked about in this video. And until next time, be safe, be well, and happy reading. Bye everyone.